The wagon wheel cracked through the ice on the rut, and Fern didn't even flinch. She'd stopped flinching at things 3 weeks ago, somewhere between burying her mother and watching the bankman nail the notice to the front door of the only home she'd ever known. After that, a broken wheel felt like just another fact, the world breaking one more time. Fine, let it. She climbed down from the seat and stood in the mud looking at the damage. The left rear wheel had split clean along the grain, the iron rim half buried in frozen slush. The horse, Old Pepper, borrowed from Mrs. Alderman, who was probably already regretting that kindness, stood with her head low and her ears flat, wanting nothing to do with the wind coming off the ridge. It was late afternoon. The light was doing that thing it did in November in the high country, going from grey to grey dark without ever becoming anything close to golden. The trees on either side of the road were bare and black, and they made the sky look smaller than it was. Fern had $17 and a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and she was heading to her cousin Mabel's place in Dalton Crossing, which was still 14 miles north. She had no idea how to fix a wheel. She had no idea who lived out here. She stood in the road and looked at the horse, and the horse looked back at her, and neither of them had anything useful to offer. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. The road was too soft for that. It was the sound of an axe, somewhere up the tree line, a steady rhythm that paused and then resumed. She turned toward it. Through the bare aspens she could make out a shape, large, moving with the slow deliberateness of someone who had been doing the same thing for many years, and had no reason to hurry. She almost didn't call out. The size of him, even at distance, was the kind of size that made a woman recalculate. He was wearing a canvas coat that had been dark once and was now the color of tree bark. He had an axe in one hand and a length of timber balanced across one shoulder, and he moved through the trees, like the trees had been placed there for his convenience. But the light was going, and she had $17 and a broken wheel. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He stopped, turned. Even from 20 feet, she could see his face was mostly beard, the eyes beneath the brim of his hat unreadable. He looked at her the way you'd look at something unexpected, not alarmed, just noting it. "Wheel," she said, and gestured, feeling foolish. He walked out of the trees without saying anything, set the timber down against a birch, walked to the wagon and crouched beside the broken wheel, and looked at it for a long moment the way a man looks at something he's already decided about. He stood up. "Got a spare?" he said. No. He looked at the timber he'd set down, then at the wheel. He had the kind of face that did its thinking without advertising it. Finally he said, "I can fix it. Take a while." "I don't have anything to pay you," she said. She wanted to say it before he asked, "Get it out of the way." He looked at her then. Not at her, the way some men looked, measuring and calculating. Just looked, the way you'd look at someone who'd said something that didn't quite make sense. "Didn't ask you to," he said. His name was Corwin. She learned that later. In those first minutes, he didn't offer it and she didn't ask. He just went back into the tree line and came out with tools she hadn't seen him carrying, and he set to work on the wheel with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had fixed broken things his whole life. She stood back and watched. Pepper had relaxed some, was pulling at a tuft of dead grass at the road's edge. The wind was picking up off the ridge. "You live near here?" she asked after a while. "Up the draw," he said. He didn't look up from what he was doing. His hands were large and rough, and they moved with a kind of careful precision that didn't match the rest of him. "Alone?" A pause. "Yes." She didn't ask anything else. There was something about the way he'd said it. Not sad. Not defensive. Just a fact. Like the broken wheel, like the coming dark. The way people say things when they've long since made their peace with them. The repair took nearly an hour. By the time he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag from his coat pocket, the light had gone to that flat grey that comes just before dark, the kind where you can still see, but nothing casts a shadow anymore. "That'll hold," he said. "Don't push her hard and stay out of the deep ruts. Get to Dalton Crossing in that? That's where I'm going. My cousin's." He nodded, started gathering his tools. Fern looked at the road. She'd been trying to do the arithmetic in her head for the last 20 minutes, and it kept coming out the same. 14 miles, no lantern, a horse that was already tired, a road she didn't know. "How far to Dalton Crossing from here?" she said. "In the dark." He looked at the sky. She saw something shift in his face, some small recalculation. "You don't have a lantern," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the timber he'd set against the birch and balanced it on his shoulder again. He looked up the drawer, where presumably his cabin was, and then he looked at her, and she could see him working through something, turning it over. "There's a room," he said finally, "at the cabin. Not much, but it's got a door that latches." He said it to the road, not to her, like he was reporting a fact about the property rather than making an offer. "Wood stove's already going. I was going to cook anyway." He picked up his axe. He looked at her once more, brief and direct. "Up to you," he said, and then he started walking up the drawer, because he was apparently not the kind of man who waited around to see if his offers were accepted. He just made them and moved on. Fern stood in the road next to her patched wheel and her tired horse and watched him walk away. Every sensible thing she knew about the world said to climb back onto that seat and take her chances with the dark road. She tied Pepper's lead to the wagon and followed him up the draw. The cabin was small, and it was serious, the way things built by one person for purely practical reasons tend to be serious. No porch decoration, no window boxes, just solid log construction, a good chimney, a lean-to on the side, where firewood was stacked higher than her head. He had put up a lot of wood, more than one person needed, she thought, and then she thought maybe that was just what you did out here. Maybe you put up wood the way other people saved money, because it was the thing that stood between you and a bad outcome. He took Pepper around to a small corral at the back without being asked. She heard him speaking to the horse in a low voice, not words she could make out, just tone. She heard water being poured. When he came back around the side of the cabin, his coat was off, and he was in his shirt-sleeves, despite the cold, and he was carrying a bundle of hay. "She'll be fine for the night," he said, going past her toward the door. "There's a bucket inside, water barrels around back if she wants more." Inside, the cabin smelled like pine resin and wood smoke, and something faintly animal, not unpleasant. The stove was going, and the heat hit her like a soft wall. Her hands, which she hadn't realized were numb, began to ache as they warmed. He hung his coat on a hook by the door. He washed his hands at her. His hands at a basin, he moved around the small space with the confidence of a man who had never had to share it, and had organized it entirely around his own habits. Everything had a place. The place made sense only to him. He pulled a cast-iron pan from a hook above the stove and set it on the grate without looking at her. "You eat salt pork?" he said. "Yes." "Cornbread?" "Yes." That appeared to settle things. He pulled a crock down from a shelf and lifted the lid, and the smell of cured meat filled the room. He sliced it in silence. The fat hit the hot iron, and the sizzle was very loud in the quiet cabin. Fern set her carpet bag down near the door, not wanting to presume, and looked around for somewhere to sit that was clearly intended for sitting. There was a stool by the stove. She took it. "I'm Fern," she said. "Fern Calloway." He turned the pork slices, didn't look up right away. "Corwin," he said. "Just Corwin. That's what people call me." She watched him cook. He did it the way he did everything, without wasted motion, without commentary. The cornbread was already made, a skillet's worth sitting on top of the stove, wrapped in a cloth, and she realized he'd baked it that morning, or the night before. Just for himself, just as a matter of course. Not because company was coming, just because that's what he did. That detail did something to her she hadn't expected. There was something very human about it, very ordinary. A man who baked cornbread alone in a cabin in the mountains because he liked cornbread. It made him reel in a way that his size and his silence hadn't. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. 8 years. Alone?" He was quiet for a moment. He flipped the pork again. "My wife passed. 9 years ago now." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, not inviting sympathy, not deflecting it either. Just information, offered because she'd asked an adjacent question. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once. "You were going to your cousin's?" "Yes, my mother." She stopped. Started again. "We lost the farm. The bank. There wasn't anything left to stay for." He didn't say anything to this which she appreciated. People always said things that were meant to be comforting and were instead just noise. He just listened, or didn't listen, she couldn't tell which, and either way he wasn't filling the space with words she'd have to receive and respond to. He put a tin plate on the small table. Pork. Cornbread cut in 2 thick slabs. A jar of something amber. Sorghum, she realized, when he set it beside the plate. "Sit," he said. He took his own plate and sat on the other stool, the one near the window, and ate without ceremony. She ate too. The pork was crisp at the edges, and she hadn't eaten since morning, and she had to remind herself not to eat too fast, because she was a grown woman and could manage herself. The sorghum was very good. She said so. "From a family down the valley," he said. "Trade them firewood for it. You trade in firewood, trade in whatever people need." He said it without pride. It was just a system, like the cornbread, like the organized tools. A man who had worked out how to live. After supper, he showed her the room. It was small, a curtained corner, really, with a cot that had a wool blanket on it, and a peg on the wall, and a candle on a shelf. "Door latches from the inside," he said. He showed her the simple wooden latch. He did it without drama or suggestion, just demonstrating a feature of the space. Then he went back to the main room, and she heard him add wood to the stove, and then the sound of him settling, and then not much of anything at all. She latched the door. She sat on the cot in the candlelight. She thought about the bank notice on the door of the farmhouse. She thought about the sound her mother had made. In those last weeks, the small sounds of a person going. She thought about Dalton Crossing and Cousin Mabel, who she hadn't seen in 4 years, who might or might not actually have room, who had written one letter saying, "Come if you need to," and might have meant it at the time. She thought about how Corwin had said, "I can fix it," about the wheel before she'd asked him to, before she'd given him any reason. Just looked at the broken thing and said, "I can fix it," and started working. She blew the candle out and lay in the dark and listened to the wind come off the ridge and hit the cabin walls, and the cabin didn't move at all. She slept. She woke early, grey light through the curtain, and lay still for a moment listening. From the other side of the curtain, she heard the stove door open and close. The sound of kindling, then nothing, and then footsteps, quiet for such a large man, going to the door, and then the door opening and closing, and then outside, silence again, except for the wind. She dressed. She folded the blanket. She pulled the curtain back. He'd left coffee on the stove, an actual pot of coffee, already made, sitting on the grate, where it would stay warm. A tin cup beside it, nothing else, no note, no instruction, just the coffee, like it was obvious, like of course there would be coffee. She stood at the window with the cup and watched him in the grey morning. He was at the corral, and she realized after a moment that he was checking Pepper, running his hand along the horse's leg, lifting the hoof, looking at something. Pepper stood quietly under his hands, the way horses stand for people they've decided to trust. She watched him replace the hoof, watched him say something to the horse, watched the horse's ear swivel toward him. She was still standing there when he came back inside. He didn't seem surprised to see her up. He went to the stove, checked the coffee level, poured himself a cup. "Left rear shoe is loose," he said. "She'll throw it before Dalton Crossing. Road's rough through the canyon. Can you?" She started, and then felt presumptuous. "I'll fix it," he said, not waiting for her to ask, just noting a problem and announcing its resolution. He pulled on his coat. He picked up a wooden box of tools by the door. He went back outside, Fern finished her coffee. She washed her cup in the basin. She looked around the cabin, the serious, practical space, and she thought about the 14 miles of rough canyon road and the cousin she hadn't seen in 4 years, and the letter that had said, "Come, if you need to," which might have meant it, and might have been politeness. And she honestly could not remember which kind of person Mabel was anymore. When Corwin came back and his hands were dirty and he was pulling off his coat, and she was still there, standing in the middle of the room with her cup washed and her bag by the door. He hung his coat. He looked at her, just looked. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know if going to Mabel's is. I don't know if she's actually expecting me. I don't know if there's room." She stopped. "I don't have anywhere that's actually expecting me." He went to the basin. He washed his hands. He dried them on the cloth by the basin with the slow, careful attention he gave to everything. He turned around. "I got a trap line that needs running," he said. "Takes me 3 days up the north face. I've been putting it off." He looked at the stove. Then at her, "Cabin needs tending while I'm gone." Fire kept going. Chickens fed. He said it to the room in general, in the tone of a man describing a problem he hadn't figured out yet. "I'd pay for that, work trade." She looked at him. 3 days, she said. 3 days. And then he was quiet. He seemed to be genuinely considering the question, rather than already knowing the answer, which made her trust it more. "And then you'd know whether you wanted to stay or go," he said. "And you'd have something in your pocket either way." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was an arrangement, plainly stated, with terms and an exit built in. She could leave after 3 days with money and a rested horse and a shoe that wouldn't throw. No obligation beyond that. She looked at the stove, the coffee still on the grate, the cornbread tin on the shelf. "How do you like your fire kept?" she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down somewhere solid. "Hot," he said. "I get cold easy." He picked up his pack from beside the door, the one that had apparently been ready to go for days. He checked something on the outside of it, a strap or a buckle. He put it on. He paused at the door. "Chickens are in the lean-to," he said. "They don't need much. Just talk to them some. They do better when someone talks to them." He opened the door. The cold morning came in. "Corwin," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for the wheel, and the shoe, and all of it." He looked at her for a moment. In the morning light his face was less unreadable than it had seemed the night before. There was something tired in it, and something careful, and something that had been alone for a long time, and had gotten used to that, and might, possibly, be getting used to something else. "Coffee'll stay warm on the low side of the grate," he said. "Don't let it smelled like him. He won't let it boil down to nothing." He walked out into the grey morning and up the trail toward the north face, and Fern stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched him go until the trees took him, and then she went inside and shut the door against the cold and stood in the warmth of the serious, practical, quietly tended space he had built for himself, and thought that 3 days was not very long at all. The chickens, it turned out, liked to be told about ordinary things. She started with the weather and moved on to the particulars of how a bank notice sounds when it's being nailed through wood. And the chickens listened, with their heads tilted in that way chickens had, as if everything you said was being carefully considered, and she found that this was a surprisingly useful thing. She kept the fire hot. She did not let the coffee boil down to nothing. On the third morning she woke before the light and lay listening to the wind off the ridge, and thought about roads that were still open, and about what it meant to be somewhere that was not expecting you, and to find, improbably, that the place made room anyway. She heard his boots on the path before she heard anything else. She was at the stove when the door opened, coffee already on, and she didn't turn around right away because she was pouring and she didn't want to spill it. And by the time she turned he was already in the room, pack down, coat on a hook, hands at the basin. He looked at the coffee. then at her. "Fire's good," he said. "You said you get cold easy." He dried his hands. He sat down on the stool by the stove and accepted the cup she held out and wrapped both hands around it, and the tension went out of his shoulders all at once, slow and complete, the way cold leaves a room when the fire's right. Outside, Pepper moved in the corral. The chickens had started their morning sounds in the lean-to. "Mabel," he said after a while. "Probably doesn't have room," Fern said. Probably meant the letter kindly, and not literally. "That's Mabel." He drank his coffee. "Trapline does better when someone's keeping the cabin," he said. "Less on my mind." She looked out the window at the grey morning going gold at the tree line, the first real colour she'd seen in days. "I'd need to know where things are," she said. "Properly. If I'm going to tend a place, I need to know where things are." "I can show you," he said. "And I'd want to learn the chickens' names." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted the way it had when she'd asked about the fire, that quiet setting down of something long carried. "They don't have names," he said. "They do now," she said. "I've been calling them things for 3 days. They answer." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the light was coming stronger, coming gold and real through the bare aspens, filling up the window, filling up the small, serious cabin with something it hadn't had in a long while. "All right," he said.